Hello learners, welcome back to my channel. This is part 1 of my Kubernetes for AI crash course series. If you have spent even a little time in cloud, DevOps or AI infrastructure, you might have heard this advice over and over again. That is, learn Kubernetes, deploy projects. You only learn when you break things. And yes, that's true. But one thing that almost nobody talks about is how fast this ecosystem is changing. The Kubernetes course that you bought last year, a lot of it is already outdated. Architectures have evolved and Kubernetes versions change constantly because it's open source. So wherever you are learning Kubernetes from, it needs to upgrade every few months. Apart from that, expectations from engineers are changing too. Today, Kubernetes is not just for DevOps anymore. AI engineers, platform engineers, data engineers, anyone who's running workloads at scale will benefit from understanding Kubernetes. So in this series, we will be going through an updated version of Kubernetes and will not just learn it from a traditional DevOps perspective. We are learning it with a modern AI-focused lens. Now let me tell you a bit about the series. Now this is a two-part series. In part 1, we'll focus on Kubernetes foundations and intermediate concepts, how it works, what are the components that make up a cluster, what has changed, the core objects you deploy, and how applications actually scale in production systems. So we'll not just dive into the core concepts, but we'll also focus on deployment and scaling strategies. Then in part 2, we'll build on top of that and move into the AI-specific workloads, distributed training, inference serving, scheduling, and you might have heard about different tools that are part of this newer ecosystem. So we will focus on that. So if you're a beginner who has never touched Kubernetes before, or someone who's trying to strengthen your fundamentals before moving into AI infrastructure, this series is designed to build that mental model end to end. Let's dive in. Before we dive into Kubernetes, we need to first understand why it exists. Let me give you a horizontal timeline. It all started with a monolithic application. One giant code base, one deployment, one server, easy to build at first, easy to deploy at first. But as soon as your team grows or the traffic grows, the monolithic environment breaks down. One small bug can crash everything. And if you have a tiny change, you have to redeploy the entire app. So the industry then moved to microservices. Here, they break the monolith application into different services, each doing just one job. User service, payment service, notification service, everything was independent of each other. If one thing fails, it doesn't take down the whole cluster. But microservices then created newer problems. Now you have 50 services running on different machines with different dependencies, runtimes, libraries. So deploying them was painful. This is where Docker came in. Containers gave them a way to package the app with everything it needs: code, runtime, libraries, all into one portable unit. Now with portable, what I mean is that same container can run in your laptop, in a physical server, in a cloud server, everywhere. Problem solved. Except now you have thousands of containers. Who starts them? Who restarts them when it crashes? Who will decide which machine they run on? Or what's the networking and how are they communicating with each other? These were just few problems. And this is where Kubernetes came in as a savior. In one line, Kubernetes is the operating system for your containers. Scheduling, scaling, healing, networking, all of it. Now, the origination came from Google, who ran containers in planet scale for maps, for Gmail, for search. This was an internal cluster management system called Borg. And in 2014, Kubernetes was officially announced as an open source tool. Now, that was a quick history around why we are leveraging Kubernetes today. Now, before we dive deeper into the core object, let's first understand how people actually run Kubernetes. And there isn't just one way. There are two broad categories around how you deploy Kubernetes, and the one you pick depends on where you are in your journey. The first is self-hosted Kubernetes. Here you install and manage the Kubernetes yourself. This is also how most people learn, and there are great tools for running Kubernetes on your local laptop. First, Minikube. You can install Kubernetes using Minikube. It spins up a single node Kubernetes cluster inside a virtual machine on your machine. It makes you feel closest to how the real cluster works. The next one is Kind. It's a short form of Kubernetes in Docker. It runs the cluster inside a Docker container instead of a VM. It's pretty fast to start and lighter in weight, so very good for local testing. Then there is K3s, which is a lightweight production distribution from Rancher. It strips out a lot of bulk and runs very well on smaller machines. Now, a lot of enterprises who are running self-managed production clusters, they use tools like KubeADM, Kops, or Cluster APIs. But that's a bigger commitment and there's a lot of operational overhead there. If you're learning, you can also go for pre-configured labs where these institutions basically give you the whole cluster environment and you just have to run your workloads on it. Now the second category is cloud managed Kubernetes. This is where the cloud provider runs the control plane for you. EKS on AWS, GKE on GCP, AKS on Azure, OKE in OCI. So in this category, you don't have to manage the control plane components, which we'll dive deeper in the next section. You just create a cluster, create a node pool and run your workloads. A quick tip tip here, Kubernetes is actually hard, and offloading the control plane to the cloud provider is usually worth it. If you're just starting out and if you don't want to run any clusters on the cloud provider, I've added a small setup guide with K3s in the description below. So make sure you practice the basics on a local cluster first and then progress into the cloud-based clusters. Now, another thing to understand upfront, Kubernetes is declarative. You don't tell it how to do things. You just tell it what you want. And the way you describe what you want is through manifest files, usually in YAML format, also supported in JSON. You write a YAML file that says, I want 3 replicas of this app exposed on port 40 with this much memory, and you hand it to Kubernetes with a command line interface called kubectl. This is the why and the how of the Kubernetes world. Now let's get into the architecture that makes it work. A Kubernetes cluster has two halves, control plane and data plane. The control plane is the brain and the data plane is where your workloads run. Let's first start with the control plane. The API server is the front door of the entire cluster. Every command you run with kubectl, every controller, every other component, they all talk to API server first. The job of API server here is to validate the requests, authenticate them, and write the desired state to etcd server. Note, if the API server is down, your cluster is basically frozen. Now, speaking of etcd, it is a database. It's basically a distributed key value store that holds the entire state of your cluster. Every pod, every service, every config. If you lose your every database, you lose the state of your cluster. This is why a production every database is always backed up and run in multiple replicas. Then there is scheduler. The main job of scheduler here is to watch for newer pods that don't have any nodes assigned yet. It looks at resource request, affinity, and picks the best node for each pod. Now don't get confused with all the terms that I just said. We'll be going through it in a few minutes. The next component is controller manager, which runs all the controllers that maintains the desired state of the cluster. The deployment controller, the replica set controller, the node controller. So the controller manager basically manages these different controllers. Now what these controllers do, each of these controllers watches the API server, sees the different what's the desired state versus what's the actual state, and then it works to close the gap. This control loop is the core idea of Kubernetes. Quick aside on controllers, because you'll hear that word a lot even with AI workloads. You need to understand that controller is just a program that runs on a loop. For example, the deployment controller makes sure that a desired number of pods are always running. If you terminate a pod manually, the deployment controller will bring it back. Now here's the most powerful part. Kubernetes lets you write your own controllers and manage your own objects. For example, I can write a controller program that can manage the object type Vishaka. Even though Vishaka is not a Kubernetes native object, I can make it run within a Kubernetes cluster. I don't know what the Vishaka pod will do here. Jokes aside, now when you bundle the controller with a custom object type, this is a whole application known as operator. We'll go deep in how they work in part 2. The next object is Cloud Controller Manager. This is basically the bridge to your cloud provider. When you create a load balancer service inside your Kubernetes cluster, it's the Cloud Control Manager's job to talk to the provider and provision a cloud-based load balancer for your cluster. So for example, this component will talk to AWS to provision Elastic Load Balancer. Same for GCP, same for Azure. Now it's time to move into the data plane objects. This is where your containers actually run. Now every worker node runs a few core pieces. First one is the kubelet. It's an agent on each node. Don't get confused with an AI agent here. The job of kubelet is to talk to the API server, get its assigned pods, and then tell the container runtime to start them. It's also responsible to report the node health back to the control plane. Now, speaking of container runtime, this is the interface that actually runs your containers. And here's where things have changed. For years, the default container runtime for Kubernetes was Docker. But in the latest Kubernetes version, Docker shim was removed. Today, the standard runtimes that can be used within Kubernetes is Containerd or CRIO. Both of these runtimes talk to the kubelet using the container runtime interface. Don't get confused here. Docker is still the tool used to build images and run containers, but it's no longer the runtime inside your Kubernetes cluster. Now, next piece is networking. This is where the CNI aka Container Networking Interface comes into picture. Now, the official Kubernetes project defines the spec of how actually these networking plugins should work, but it doesn't include one by default. So if you do not have a plugin installed, your pods cannot talk to each other. Now, when you pick a CNI plugin and install it on your cluster, the job of the plugin is to give every pod an IP address. And this is what enables different pods on different nodes to talk to each other. The common choices of CNI plugins are Calico, Cilium, Flannel. Cilium, you may hear a lot about the Cilium plugin. It's the modern favorite because it also includes eBPF module. which is responsible to handle networking on the Linux kernel. And it's not only faster, but it also gives you better observability. It monitors different network calls happening between different pods. So it helps you log and audit different network calls happening between pods. Also, Cilium with eBPF has replaced kubeproxy entirely. Now, how do you enable CNI? You install it as a daemon set after the cluster is created. Now, what is daemon set? It is a pod that runs on every node in a cluster. Think of it as a background service that runs on every node in a cluster. So, daemon set is an important object type, so keep it here. Now, historically, there was kubeproxy as well, which used to handle the service networking, taking a service IP and routing it to the right pods using IP tables. But like I said, it has been replaced by CNI plugin. That said, a lot of companies are still using kubeproxy, so it's good to know. Next one is CoreDNS, runs as pods inside a cluster, and its job is service discovery. Now, CoreDNS runs as a pod in every cluster, and it has replaced kubeDNS as the default DNS server. As the name suggests, it's a DNS server that resolves names. When a pod wants to talk to another pod using a DNS name, CoreDNS is responsible to resolve it. This is the architecture that has changed a bit in this year. Now, let's focus on the core object. Now, Kubernetes has a lot of core objects. Just make it a little easy to understand. I have split it across 6 core buckets. Those buckets are workloads, scheduling, networking, storage, config and isolation, and the most critical one, security and access control. Let's start with workloads. This is where the actual application runs. Let's go through the main objects one by one. The first one is pod. It is the smallest deployable unit in Kubernetes. It is basically a wrapper around one or more containers that need to run together, share the same network, and share storage. Most of the time, a pod has just one container. But sometimes you'll see two patterns. Number one, a sidecar. It is a helper container running next to your main app. Things like logging agent, a service mesh proxy, or a config loader. The second pattern is an init container. This one runs before the main container starts. It does setup work like downloading a model, waiting for a database, or fixing permissions and then exits. Only after it succeeds does the main container start. In AI workloads, this is exactly where your model container runs. Init containers download model weights at startup, and sidecars handle things like metrics exporting. Our second set of objects are replica set and deployment. Now, if a pod dies, nothing brings it back. That's why we don't create pods directly. We use replica set. Its job is simple. Keep a fixed number of pods running at all times. But we don't even create replica sets directly. We create a deployment which manages the replica set for us. Why? Because the deployment adds the most important feature, rolling updates and rollbacks. Now here's the spec for a deployment config. A few important fields here are number one, replicas, which basically tells how many pods we want. Then we have selector.match labels. This is how the deployment finds which pods belongs to it. And it has to match template metadata.labels exactly. This is one of the most common YAML mistakes. Then we have the image. It is a container image to run and the container port, the port your application listens on. Here's a simple flow. When you update the image, the deployment creates a new replica set, scales up the new pods gradually, and scales down the old ones. This basically ensures zero downtime. Our next topic is autoscaling. Now, how do we scale our workloads on Kubernetes? There are basically 3 Kubernetes native options. The simplest one is manual scaling. You change the number of replicas, apply the YAML, and Kubernetes scales up. This works if you know your traffic ahead of time. But traffic isn't always predictable. That's where the horizontal pod autoscaler, aka HPA, comes in. It watches a metric like CPU or memory and automatically scales pods up or down to keep that metric at a target value. This is an example HPA YAML file where you specify the kind horizontal pod autoscaler, and in the spec, as you can see, we have specified a scaled target ref which points to the deployment we are scaling. Then you set the min replicas and the max replicas. This is basically the floor and ceiling. And you also specify an average utilization, basically a target threshold. For HPA to work, your cluster needs the metric servers running. On managed clusters, it's usually pre-installed. A third option is the VPA. This is the other dimension. Instead of changing the number of pods, it changes how much CPU and memory each pod gets. HPA scales out and VPA scales up. VPA mainly works around two things inside the pod spec: resource requests, and resource limits. Now, resource requests and limits comes under the scheduling bucket. We'll dive into it further. As an example, VP continuously monitors the actual CPU and memory usage of a running pod over time. Based on those usage patterns, it calculates better request and limit values automatically. And when VP applies new resource values, the pod usually has to be restarted because CPU and memory requests are part of the pod spec and can't be changed live on an already running container. There's also a cluster autoscaler, which is not built directly into core Kubernetes, but it is part of the official Kubernetes ecosystem and maintained by Kubernetes project. Its job is simple. If pods can't be scheduled because the cluster is out of resources, add nodes. And if nodes stay underutilized for a while, remove those nodes. And then there is KEDA. KEDA stands for Kubernetes Event Driven Autoscaler. It extends HPA to scale on basically anything: queue depth, request rate, custom Prometheus metrics, even cloud queue length. CPU is often a poor signal for real load. KEDA lets you scale on the signal that actually matters. In AI workloads, this is huge. We use KEDA to scale inference pods on things like request queue depth or GPU utilization, not just on CPU, because CPU tells us nothing about how busy the GPUs actually are. Our next key object under this bucket is stateful set. For applications that hold data, such as databases, message queues, pods need stable identities and stable storage. That's stateful set. Each pod here gets a stable name. They start in order. Each one gets its own persistent storage that survives even if the pod is rescheduled. Now, vector databases, model registries, anything stateful in your AI stack needs to be defined as a stateful set. Our next object is daemon set. A daemon set runs one pod on every node automatically. Whenever a new node joins, pod is added. When a node leaves, pod goes with it. In real production clusters, a lot of things runs as daemon sets. You don't even realize what's running beneath your cluster at times. CoreDNS for service discovery is a daemon set, Cilium for networking, FluentBit for logs, and Node Exporter for metrics. In AI world, GPU drivers, device plugins, metrics exporters, all are daemon sets. If something has to run everywhere, it's a daemon set. Our next object is job and cron job. A job runs a pod to completion. It does its work and exits. A cron job, on the other hand, runs a job on a schedule, like cron, but Kubernetes native. These objects are heavily used for training runs and batch inference jobs. Now that's the workload bucket. Pod is the unit, deployment for stateless apps, HPA, VPA, cluster autoscaler, KEDA for autoscaling, stateful set for stateful apps, daemon set for node level agents, and job and cron job for batch workloads. Our bucket 2 is scheduling. Scheduling is basically how Kubernetes decides where your pod actually runs. Our first piece here is resource requests and limits. These are the metrics that are used by vertical pod autoscaler as well. Now, when you write a pod manifest, you need to define how much resources that pod needs. So, in general, every pod tells the scheduler what it needs. Requests are the guaranteed minimum, limits are the hard ceiling. The scheduler uses requests to decide which node a pod fits on, whereas limits is the hard cap on what the pod can actually use at runtime. A second object is node selector. The simplest way to pin a pod to specific nodes is node selector. You match a label, and the pod will only be scheduled on nodes that carry this label. Our next object here is node affinity. Node affinity is basically node selector with more power. It has two flavors: required rules and preferred rules. When the rule says required during scheduling, ignored during execution, it basically says that this rule must match. Otherwise, the pod doesn't schedule at all. When the rule states preferred during scheduling, ignored during execution, it's a soft hint. The scheduler tries to honor it but won't fail if it can't. Next, we have pod affinity and anti-affinity. Pod affinity attracts pods together. Anti-affinity pushes them apart. In AI, we use pod affinity to keep distributed training jobs on the same rack so they can talk over high-speed interconnects, and anti-affinity to spread inference replicas across zones for high availability. Next, we have taints and tolerations. This one's important. Taints are like a do not enter sign on a node. Only pods that explicitly tolerate that taint can land on that node. So the key thing to note here is taint is applied to nodes, whereas tolerations are something we specify at the pod level. The taint and the toleration have to match exactly. And a no schedule policy under toleration means don't schedule unless tolerated. This is huge for AI. GPU nodes get tainted, so only workloads that explicitly ask for a GPU can land there. We'll go deeper into this in part 2. Now, our next object is topology spread constraints. This basically distributes pod evenly across failure domains, zones, racks, nodes. Max Q is the biggest difference allowed between zones, and topology is the dimension you are spreading across. So, if one zone goes down, you don't lose everything. That's basically scheduling. Resource request for what your pod needs, node selector and node affinity for which nodes pod can run on, pod affinity for how pods relate to each other, taints and tolerations to protect specific nodes, and topology spread for high availability. Next, a bucket 3 is networking. Now, pods come and go. The IPs change. So, how do other pods or users on the internet reliably reach your application? That's the networking bucket. First is CNI. Now, Kubernetes ships without networking. Yes, you read that right. The project defines the spec, but you pick a CNI, which is a container network interface plugin, and you have to explicitly install it. That's what gives every pod an IP and lets pod on different nodes talk. Some common choices here is Calico, Cilium, Flannel, VPC CNI, Azure CNI. Cilium has become the modern favorite. It uses eBPF to handle networking directly in the Linux kernel, which is faster and gives you better observability. The CNI gets installed as a daemon set right after cluster creation. Without it, your nodes stay stuck in not ready and no pod ever gets an IP. Now, here's why CNI matters for AI workloads. When you run distributed training, your pods are constantly exchanging gradients. That's basically gigabits of data flying between pods every second. A bad CNI choice can cut your training speed in half. Now, for high-end training use cases, AI clusters use specialized networking, such as remote direct memory access, Rocky, or InfiniBand. These plug into Kubernetes through CNIs, which lets a single pod attach to multiple networks, one for regular traffic, another for the high-speed fabric between these accelerated compute. Next, we have services. A service gives you a stable IP and DNS name in front of a group of pods. Even when pods come and go, the service keeps routing to whichever pods match its label selector. Now, there are three types of services. Cluster IP, which is internal only. Now, a cluster IP service is only reachable inside the cluster. So, if you want to access it from your laptop temporarily, you use kubectl port forward, which basically creates a tunnel from your local machine to the pod or services inside the cluster. Next is node port. This opens the same port on every node. This is mostly used for dev environments. The third service type is load balancer. This provisions a real cloud load balancer and points it at your pods. This is basically how you expose a service to the internet. In the service spec, the main pieces here are selector, which basically tells which pods this service routes to, then the port the service exposes. Target port is the port on the pod. So make sure you understand the difference between port and target port. Port is what service exposes, and target port is the port on the pod. And then you specify the service type. Now, there are two AI patterns to know here. For inference workloads, your model API sits behind a service, and that service has multiple replicas. So, the service basically helps with automatic load balancing. Now, another key component within the networking space is Ingress and Gateway API. Service handles layer 4, just IPs and ports. But most real apps need layer 7 capabilities such as host-based routing, path-based routing, and TLS termination. That's where Ingress historically came in. And Ingress is a set of rules. For example, you send a traffic for api.example.com to this service, send app.example.com to that other one. You need an Ingress controller running in your cluster to actually enforce these rules. These controllers could be a proxy, Nginx, or traffic. Now, Ingress was designed for HTTP and barely extended to anything else. So, the community built the Gateway API as the successor. Gateway API is the more expressive version of Ingress. It natively supports HTTP, TCP, gRPC, and TLS. It also spans across different namespaces. It splits responsibilities cleanly. Infrastructure teams manages the gateway, application teams manages the HTTP routes. Now, for AI workloads, this is exactly how you expose inference endpoints to the world. A few specific things matter here. Path-based routing lets you serve multiple models from one endpoint. /v1/model/llama goes to one service. /v1/model/Mistral goes to another. The another key piece with gateway APIs is the rollout strategy. Canary rollouts are native to gateway APIs. You can send 5% of inference traffic to a new model version, watch the metrics, and then ramp up. Also, the gRPC support is huge. Most modern serving frameworks such as Kserve, VLLM, they all use gRPC for high throughput inference. Gateway APIs handles gRPC natively. Old Ingress doesn't. Our next bucket is storage. Pods are ephemeral. When a pod dies, anything written to its file system is gone. So, how do databases work? How do you store user uploads? That's basically the storage bucket. There are four key components here. Number one is persistent volume. Think of a persistent volume or PV as a cluster resource that holds data, just like CPU or memory. A PV is just a YAML object in Kubernetes, but it has to be backed up by real physical storage somewhere. A local disk, an NFS server, EBS volume, GCP persistent disk, etc. Kubernetes itself doesn't care about the actual storage. The PV is just an interface that you, as a cluster administrator, point at the real thing. Now, one important thing to note here is local versus remote storage. Local volumes are tied to one specific node. If that node dies, your data is gone with it. Remote volumes, on the other hand, such as NFS, EBS, cloud storage, they survive node failures, pod failures, and even full stateful set deletions. For anything stateful in production, you almost always want remote storage. Now, you have a persistent volume, but how does your application actually request it? That's where the persistent volume claim or PVC comes in. The PVC is how a developer asks for storage. Example, if a developer comes in and asks for a 10 gigabyte read-write access storage, Kubernetes finds a PV that matches and binds them together. Then, in your pod spec, you reference this claim, and inside the container, you mount it at a path. Now, three things to note here. First, the access modes. It could be read-write once, read-only many, or read-write many. This is basically the access permission you set on the pod level. Then, the amount of storage requested and the storage class that should provision it. Now, our next component here is storage class. Imagine a cluster with hundreds of apps requesting storage every day. An admin creating persistent volumes manually for each one, it doesn't scale. That's where the storage class comes in. A storage class dynamically provisions PVs on demand. This is the flow. Pod is created with PVC. PVC requests storage class. Now, provisioner calls Cloud API. Cloud creates the disk. The PV is created and then it's bounded to PVC and mounted into the pod. Now, when a developer creates a PVC and references a storage class, Kubernetes automatically calls the Cloud API, creates a disk, creates a matching PV, and binds it to the claim. No manual work. Our next component here is CSI. Underneath all of this is the CSI, the Container Storage Interface. CSI is how storage vendors plug into Kubernetes without modifying core code. AWS, GCP, Azure, OCI, they all ship their own CSI drivers. A CSI driver runs as two pieces, a daemon set for the node plugin, so the kubelet can mount volumes, and a deployment for the controller plugin, which talks to the storage backend to create and delete volumes. You install the driver via Helm, then create a storage class that references it. That's storage. PV is the storage object, PVC is how you request it, storage class automates provisioning, and CSI is the plugin layer connecting Kubernetes to actual storage. Our next bucket is config and isolation. There are two more groups of objects you'll use consistently: config map and secret. Config maps hold non-sensitive configuration, environment variables, config files, command line arguments, and inject them into pods as environment variables or mount them as files. The win here is decoupling config from your container image. Same image, different config across different environments. Now, secrets are the same idea but for sensitive data. Passwords, API keys, TLS certs, they're all base 64 encoded by default, which is not encryption. We'll cover real secrets handled in the security bucket. For AI workloads, you store model configs in config maps and hub tokens or registry credentials in secrets. Next, and the most important object is namespace. Namespaces partitions a cluster. Different teams, different environments, different apps, each in their own namespace. This is the foundation of multi-tenancy. Then there is resource quota. A resource quota caps how much a namespace can consume. CPU, memory, number of pods, even number of GPUs. Without quotas, one team can accidentally take down a shared cluster. With quotas, the platform enforces fairness. In multi-tenant AI clusters, this is exactly how you cap one team's GPU consumption. Otherwise, one training job can consume every GPU in the cluster. That's config and isolation. Config map and secret for configuration, namespace, and resource quota for multi-tenancy. A last bucket is security and access control. A cluster without a security is a liability. There are three layers that matter: who can do what can talk to what, and what pods are allowed to do. Our first component here is RBAC. RBAC stands for Role Based Access Control, and it answers the question who can do what. A service account is the identity a pod runs as. A role defines a set of permissions, such as read pods, create deployments, and a role binding ties the role to the service account. In the role, which resources and which verbs are allowed. In the role binding, who gets the permissions and which role grants them. The principle here is least privilege. So every workload gets exactly the permissions it needs, nothing more. Our next component here is network policy. Every pod in a Kubernetes cluster can talk to every other pod across every namespace. That's terrible for security. Network policies are how you write firewall rules. Front-end pods can talk to the back-end pods on port 8080. Nothing else can talk to the back-end pods at all. The key parameters to note here is pod selector, which basically tells which pods this policy applies to, and policy type specify the path, ingress, egress, or both. Ingress.from specifies which pods can send traffic in, and ports are basically which ports are allowed to receive traffic. One thing to note here is network policies are only enforced if your CNI supports them. A next piece here is pod security standards, aka PSS. It defines what pods can do at the container level. Can they run as root? Can they mount the host file system? Can they use privileged mode? Kubernetes ships three profiles: privileged, baseline, and restricted. You apply these at the namespace level with labels, and the API server enforces them. Pod security policies were the old way, but they were removed in the latest version. Next piece here is external secrets. For real secrets handling, you don't store them in Kubernetes secrets directly. You use an external secret manager such as HashiCorp Vault or a cloud secret service. The external secrets operator syncs them in. That way, the actual secret never lives in your Git repo or your YAML manifest. That's basically the security bucket. RBAC is used for who can do what. Network policies help with who can talk to what. Pod security standards for what pods can do, and external secrets for where secrets actually live. So you have your workloads now. Networking is set, storage is set, config, security. But how do you actually roll out new versions safely? This is where deployment strategies come into picture. There are three types to be aware of. Rolling update is a default for deployments. Kubernetes replaces pods gradually here. A few new ones come up, a few old ones go down until the whole fleet is on the newer version. There is zero downtime, simple, built-in, and good for most cases. The second pattern is blue-green. These run two full environments in parallel. Blue is current, green is new. You test green completely, then flip traffic by updating your service selector. There's an instant cutover and instant rollback. The cost is double here as you're running multiple resources during the switch. The third pattern to note here is canary. It sends a small slice of traffic, say 5% to the new version. You watch metrics. If it looks good, you ramp to 25, 50 or 100%. If something breaks, you roll back before most users see it. This is where also Argo rollouts and Flagger automate, often combined with a service mesh for traffic splitting. There are few more things you'll meet in production worth knowing by name. Liveness and readiness probes. This basically tells Kubernetes when a pod is healthy and when it's ready to take traffic. Then we have pod disruption budgets, which keeps a minimum number of pods running during voluntary disruptions like node upgrades. That's it. That's the foundation for Kubernetes. In summary, workloads help you define what actually runs inside the cluster. Scheduling tells where it runs. Networking defines how different objects communicate. The storage layer defines how data persists. Config and isolation helps with how everything is configured and partitioned. And security helps in keeping everything safe. These are just the core pieces, but there are additional things that you'll come across when you're actually running a cluster and deploying workloads on it. But know this, that these pieces are important both for traditional workloads as well as the newer AI workloads. In part 2, we go beyond the basics. We'll talk about custom resources, controllers, and operators. Then we'll go straight into the AI side. We'll look into scheduling of AI workloads, different storage and networking patterns, and the key tools you must be aware of within the Kubernetes space. The second one is going to be intense. Stay tuned.